Welcome to the Moveworks AI Agent Workshop. My name is John McGinley. I am a Senior Customer Success Engineer here at Moveworks, and I'm going to be walking through a use case showing off Moveworks agentic automation. For today's webinar, we're going to be covering Datadog Incident Summary. So we're going to take the incidents that we have available in our Datadog instance, and we're going to make them available via Moveworks. In future sessions, we're going to be covering ServiceNow approvals, Stripe payment lookups and refund management, and out-of-office status for Slack and Google Calendar. So as said, today's agenda is Datadog incident summaries. So before jumping into the topic directly, let's talk a little bit about building on the new Moveworks agentic automation engine. So this is kind of a lot to take in, but we can simplify it. So the Moveworks agentic automation engine is our automation engine that allows you to create plugins for your Moveworks Copilot. This allows you to deploy AI agents for any business system that you're able to integrate with, which is basically anyone that allows you to generate some form of credentials or hit it via an API call. The functions that are available to you within our agentic automation engine include triggers, thought resolvers, policy validators, and actions and activities. To give a brief overview of these, triggers is the natural language that is used by an end user to trigger the plugin that you have developed. So in this case, for Datadog incident summarization, it's me as an end user being able to come in and say, can you show me all of our open incidents in Datadog? And Moveworks being able to resolve that as a trigger for the plugin. Slot resolvers are not going to be very relevant for this session, but it's the idea that Moveworks is able to take the context of a user query and use that to make a resolution about some information that it has. So a practical example of that would be if Moveworks shows me back a list of objects and each object has a different owner, if I say, give me additional information about the one that I own, the slot that it resolves there is who am I? And it resolves that against the list that it has presented back to me. So it's able to resolve through context those types of problems. Policy validators are the validation at the API step and the workflow step. And then the actions and activities are the actual function that is called and performed. So that would be calling the Datadog incident API, grabbing the relevant information back. All of this is built on top of the agentic reasoning engine with a middleware layer that is not as visible, which includes the manifest generator, the plugin execution engine, and the action orchestrator. That is all the foundational logic that we're building on top of. So the manifest generator is basically allowing us to understand the schema of the API that we're interacting with. The execution engine is related to the triggering, so making sure that we're able to get the plugin to execute for relevant use cases. And the orchestrator is the relationship between actions that we have in a compound action setup. So you can use a plugin in agentic automation to chain multiple actions together into a single unified flow. You can define your payload schema using that manifest generator. We'll see that when we build out our connector to our Datadog instance. We can write scripts in our compound actions workflow editor that allow us to manipulate the data that's passed in through the plugin. And we can prompt the model to make unique calls to an underlying AI model to resolve some more specific problems based on natural language in that workflow editor as well. So for our example today, what we want the trigger to be is we want users to be able to come in and ask about incidents in our Datadog instance. So we might have a question like this. What are the latest incidents from our team? We want Moveworks to search for incidents listed in Datadog, and then we want it to return any open incidents and some associated information with those incidents. So this should be the general flow. When we think about building a new plugin using agentic automation, we want to think of it from the perspective of the modules that are available to us. So when we go to build a new plugin, we'll have three modules that we interact with. One is going to be the action, which is going to be an individual step and call to an API. Another is going to be a compound action, which is where we build the end-to-end flow and the intermediate logic for how the workflow will look from an end user's perspective. So we have an action or a group of actions, and within our compound action workflow editor, we can tie those together, pass data between them, and then customize the output that is available to the user. After we have built our workflow in our compound action, we can promote it to a plugin. And once we promote it to a plugin, we can define the triggering criteria and we can make it available to our users. We can make it available based on some conditional rule. We can make it available to some users based on their email address for testing and validation. Or we can open it up to everyone at their company and make it available so that everyone is able to use it. But we'll always go from an action to a compound action to a plugin. And let's hop into our demo. So I am in Moveworks setup. If I click in the upper right-hand corner, I can see that I have access to Creator Studio. And I can go in here and I can go into the plugin section. The first thing I want to do is I want to be able to define an action. So I'm going to create a new action. And when we create an action, what we're doing is we're setting up the underlying API call and response that we're going to need to present back to the user. So in this case, we want to retrieve information back from Datadog. So the first thing that we need to do as a developer is make sure that we have an understanding of the Datadog API and that we're able to query it and get information back from it. For this, I prefer using a tool like Postman. So let's use Postman. So in this case, because we want to list incidents back from our environment, I have my base URL for Datadog, which in this case is this US5 one. And then I'm going to be using this incidents API endpoint. This endpoint lists back all the incidents that we have in our environment. It comes back as an array under this data object. And then this array or list contains a set of objects where each object is an incident, and each incident has a set of attributes. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to grab an ID and the type in each object, and then grab underlying attributes in each object, and then present those back to the user. So we need to make sure that we're able to hit this endpoint in an independent system. That way we can ensure that we're able to hit it within our agentic automation platform. So I am going to set up the connector based on the information that I have configured in my Postman environment. So my base URL in this case will be everything up until the slash for the API call. And then this will be my endpoint URL. So this is the actual endpoint that we're hitting. I am going to use API key auth because Datadog uses API and application keys. And I'm going to use header auth because there's a defined header definition that Datadog expects to be able to authenticate against their instances. So the title of this for Datadog will be DD API key. And then I'm going to leverage the same API key that I confirmed is working in Postman. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to enter it here. And then Datadog also needs an application key. So I'm going to add an additional header where I add a Datadog application key. I'm going to take my application key that I used in my API call in Postman and confirmed is working. I'm going to enter that here. Because this is just a GET request, I don't need any parameters. I did not have a body developed, and I don't need any input variables. So we should be able to test this. Okay. And we got an invalid response back. So likely we would have a typo. DD application key, API key off, header off. Hmm. I also have this pre-built as an existing connector for scenarios just like this. So we have the same thing, DD API key, the API key here, with the DD application key, no params, body or input variables defined. Let me try this. Interesting. Okay, so I am getting an invalid response back from the API. So that would mean that if I did go to set up this use case, my expectation would be that it is not working. Let me try it purely using header off. Base URL here. That's interesting. Let me try importing this as curl. There we go. So that's the benefit of using a tool like Postman. When all else fails, we can use the import curl function. Presumably, I had a typo of some sort in here, and that was what was causing the issue. At a high level, you can see that the base URL is consistent with what we saw in Postman and what I had initially set up. The endpoint is the same. The meaningful difference here is this accept application JSON. So we need to ensure that the format here is correct, right? So that's something that Postman will generally automatically remediate. And it was part of my headers in Postman. So that must have been the missing element here. So again, having a separate tool where we can grab the call request, ensure that it's working as expected, all our API keys are valid. It's going to be an important element in helping us debug issues such as that. So we get a valid response back. We can see that it's the same type of response that we saw in Postman. So we have a data object, which is a list, again, of objects where each object is an incident. And then our manifest generator has output a schema here. So this schema is the expected representation and format that this API is going to give us going forward. So I'm going to save this. So this is going to be my Datadog incident summary connector. Dog. Return all existing incidents. So I have a connector name, which is going to be saved as a connector that I'm able to use in the future. So that's going to be the base URL and the authentication information, which in this case, we have no authorization information. Everything is through header off, the API name, and then the API description. So I'm going to save that. That's been saved. And now that I have an action, I need to define what the workflow of that action should be. So we're going to do that in compound actions. So I have to define a compound action name. So this will be something incident summary. And a list of all incidents. And now we have the script editor available to us. So the script editor is where we can define what the end-to-end flow, once this action is selected, should look like. So we're always going to start with a set of steps. And then under our steps block, we are going to need to define some action. And then the action is going to have an action name. It's easier to just do Command K, so action. And then we have our Datadog get incidence action. So we have our action name, which is Datadog get incidents. We're going to have progress updates, so an on complete message and an on pending message. So we're going to want to make these a little bit more straightforward. So on pending, we're going to say generating the list of existing incidents from Datadog. And our on complete message can be something like here. Here's a report of your Datadog incidents. And then let's just capitalize that for consistency. So our output key, which had this name generated, is Datadog get incidents result. So that output key is going to be the output key that we saw from our API response. So our underlying action is hitting this API endpoint. And then once it hits this API endpoint, again, it returns this object. So the output key is going to be a reference to this result. I'm just going to simplify this name to incidents because it's a list of incidents. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to return, and then we're going to have an output mapper. So I've hit the API, I have my list of incidents. What I need to do now is I need to return that list back to the user. So I'm going to have a return statement, very similar to how I would have in a function if I was coding this directly. And then since I have a list of objects, I actually want to map some attributes of that list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke a mapping function. I have to apply a converter to that, and then I'm going to define the underlying attributes from the result that I want to be available to end users. So I'm going to have some ID value that's going to reference item.id. And then for clarity's sake, this is going to, at the end, have data.incidents.data. So there we go. So when we map a result, what we're doing is we're iterating through every value in the array. So in this case, data is our global accessor. So I want to access the output key from my previous action. I do that by doing data dot and then the output key name. So once I'm in here, I have access to the result that I am getting back from the API. The result that I'm getting back from the API, again, has this data object. So what I want to do is I want to be able to map attributes from the data object from specific items in the list from that data list object. I know the syntax is a little confusing there. And then under that, each entry has an ID. And then each entry also has a set of attributes. So I could do, if I want to capture the name, I could do item.attributes.title, and then let's make that title case. And then I could also add additional fields in here as well. So if I want to include the severity, I could do item.attributes.severity. So what this will do is pulling up Postman again. This logic is going to go into each of these objects, and it's going to pull out the key that I'm dot walking into. So for this object, I'm going to grab this ID, and then I'm going to grab two items that are under this attributes object. So I dot walk into attributes. And then once I dot walk into attributes, I want to be able to grab the title. And I also want to be able to grab the severity. We should see is right here. So I expect to see that sev 2. And then it'd also be helpful to have something like the created date. So I can say created date is item.attributes.create. So if I want to add any additional fields here, I just have to make sure that I understand where those fields live in the API response, and then I can dot walk into them. So we now have a representation where we're iterating through each incident that we get back, and we're mapping them to some set of values that will return back to the user. So I can submit this. And now that I have submitted my compound action, when I'm ready, I can promote that to a plugin. So in this case, I'm ready to launch it. I want to test it for myself right now. So I'm going to promote it to a plugin. The use case name is based on my compound action and my action name. And then the short description is accurate here. We're just going to return a list of all the incidents in Datadog. So I'm going to click next. And then this is where we decide what type of language should trigger this use case. So I'm going to start with some very clear examples. Can you show me a list of incidents in Datadog? What open incidents do we have in Datadog? And then I could get more generic. Can you show me a list of incidents? What open incidents does my team have? Etc. Since there's nothing in here where we have to resolve a slot from the user input, all we have to do is understand that they're asking us to show them the incidents in Datadog. The thing that we want to make sure here is that we're capturing the language that a user would actually use. So in these two examples, I'm specifically asking for Moveworks to show me the list of incidents as they exist in Datadog. So this is a very clear example for the system to understand what the triggering event is. It might not be how users actually leverage it, though. So we might expect someone to say, can you show me a list of incidents? So for language like this, the thing that you want to be aware of as a developer is, does this conflict with any existing behavior that I have in my environment? So as an example, if you have ServiceNow as your ITSM system, in ServiceNow, your primary tickets that Moveworks supports are probably called incidents. So when you have behavior like that, you want to make sure that you really test and confirm the triggering works in the way that you expect, where it's returning this use case as opposed to incident tickets that you have open in the environment, and vice versa. So that's something to be conscientious of as you step through this, and something that you want to validate when you get to the point where you're testing the behavior. In my case, we're integrated with the Jira environment. We don't have a concept of incidents. So it's going to be a little bit more clear for our system to understand when I'm asking it for incidents that I actually want these incidents from Datadog. So as an example of what not to trigger, I could say something like, can you show me the status of a particular INC number, right? So this is to help it understand that this type of language where a user is querying for a particular INC, or the context that Moveworks is carrying through the conversation where it thinks that a user is trying to query for a particular INC is not actually relevant to this use case at all. So I'll add a final one here. And then for this, since I'm the developer and I've just implemented this, I don't want to launch it to all users. I just want to launch it to myself. So I'm going to enter my own email here and then I'm going to submit. I am now in my Moveworks bot. and I'm going to attempt to query the use case that I've just built. So what I want to be aware of here is what it shows me for what it's trying to trigger. So I see that it's going for the knowledge base. So that's not going to be my use case. And it couldn't find that list of incidents. So let me make sure that the use case is available. So there's two main methods of debugging this. One is the use case actually available to me? So I set it up and then I immediately tested it. It could take a couple minutes to propagate. Or is it a natural language problem? So the utterance that I've implemented is just not going to return that result to me based on the triggering that I've defined. So to validate something like that, I'm just going to directly copy a trigger that I've set up, and we'll see if that triggers for us appropriately. So in this case, it most likely carried the conversation context from here to here. And since I asked the same question, it said, I already know that I don't have additional information there. In this case, we did see that it did actually hit the use case. So I saw that it had showed the action name or the workflow name for a get incidents from Datadog connector. So I know that we've hit this endpoint. So right now it's reaching out to the Datadog API, it's gathering that list, and it's formatting it in the way that I defined in my workflow editor. So I can see I have the incident name, the severity, and the created date. This is all the information that I made available in my workflow editor. So a user can't ask for additional information in this case, but the important thing to note about this is that Moveworks continues the context of this conversation. So if I, in my compound action, had a follow-up where, say, I could close one of these, I would be able to say, can you close the first one? It's complete, actually. So if I had an additional action available in my workflow editor, that allowed me to action on the status of an incident, a user would be able to come in and do something like this. They wouldn't have to explicitly say, I need to update the status of an incident in Datadog and that incident number is, etc. They would just be able to say, okay, you pulled up the list of incidents for me. I want to close one. I've implemented the logic for you to close one. Do that in this case. So that's that slot resolver behavior, an example of what it would look like. But we have confirmed that our use case is working. The thing that we would want to work on now is ensuring that we capture robust triggering examples that we expect our users to leverage. So we'll want to talk to our team who leverages Datadog and asked us to implement this use case. What type of language would they use to trigger it? And get some real examples from them that we could use to fill this in and make sure that it's robust and effective. And if we ever wanted to add fields to make them available in that API response, we could always take additional API response variables and add them in here. So if I wanted to include the status, etc., I could always just add them in here. As long as they're available in the API, I can always add them in here. Okay, and that will conclude our demo. Next, let's talk about how to learn more. I highly recommend taking our Creator Studio Developer Certification. So this covers all the key concepts with step-by-step videos for Creator Studio. Creator Studio and agentic automation are very similar products, and a lot of the approach, the language, the UI, the way that you interact with it is going to be very similar between them. So I highly recommend going through this course. If you haven't, it's going to give you a lot of that foundational knowledge to make you more comfortable navigating this process until you build a couple of your own use cases and you feel confident moving forward with more. I also recommend checking out our documentation and developer community. We have developer docs, so any questions that you have about agentic automation, Creator Studio, what's available, how the syntax works, your first stop should be the developer page, seeing if that content is available to you there. If you have more specific questions, so you're trying to implement a use case, you're having some issues with it, you're unclear on the behavior that you're getting back, you can make a post in community. And if you make it under the Creator Studio or the agentic automation section in community, you can get an expert from my team or someone from the agentic automation product team to give you feedback as well as other members of the community. All right, thank you everyone for attending. Bye-bye.